This is a presentation that I gave at the Simcoe County Museum on the 24th of May 2015, and it really is an update on the current state of the Spearin Surname Project. It was a particularly great occasion because this was a reunion of Spearin cousins who had never met each other before. We had cousins who were first cousins and cousins who were ninth cousins. So it was a great opportunity to meet a lot of wonderful Spearins. And we also had the good fortune of the presence of Dr. Curtis Spearin, who donated the log cabin built in 1834 to the Simcoe County Museum in 1963. And he was there in attendance with his family, and it was great to have him there. It was a real connection with the past and with Simcoe County Museum itself, who kindly donated the use of the lecture room to us because we made the lecture open to the public. So this lecture is available on the YouTube channel DNA and Family Tree Research, and DNA testing was available at the meeting itself. Now, I started doing my family tree back in about 2005 or so, about 10 years ago, and quickly I reached brick walls in my family tree. And when I got back to my great-great-grandparents around about 1800 or so, I was only able to identify half of them. And this was after exhausting the usual traditional resources such as family lore, letters in the attic, the Bible, also the 1901 and 1911 censuses, Griffith's valuation and the cancelled books from 1870 onwards up to the 1900s, and then birth, marriages and deaths. The civil registration in Ireland started in 1865 for Catholics and 1845 for non-Catholics, church records going back to the 1800s in some cases, and then collaboration with other researchers on websites such as Ancestry, Genes Reunited, MyHeritage and RootsWeb. And various other sources were particularly useful for my connections because they were Dublin-based, so that Glasnevin cemetery records were particularly useful in this regard. But even after all of these records have been exhausted, I'm still left with this big brick wall around about the 1800-1830 timeline. And this talk is really about how DNA allowed me to break through this brick wall in my own family tree, specifically with my Spearin line, which is right there in the middle of my ancestors. And it all started really when I dropped a one-line email to Bob Spearin. I found him on the internet. He had expressed an interest in researching the Spearin family in Limerick, and he sent me a 4-page email in reply. It was more like a thesis. And he told how he discovered wills of Luke and Matthew Spearin from Limerick, based in the 1719 and 1726, and based on these we were able to reconstruct a tree of about 5 generations or so, and this particular Spearin family married into the Hartwell family. And the Hartwells were a very interesting family. They were mayors of Limerick, they'd been granted land in Clare, and there is a scrap of information, a scrap of evidence that links this Spearin family to goldsmiths in London. And these goldsmiths also had a possible connection with Cambridge. And this Cambridge connection involved Nicholas Spearin, who was given a license to print in 1534 by King Henry VIII. And he came from a large family in Flanders and was even a very good friend of Erasmus. So a fascinating story. The question in my mind was, well, does it really apply to me? Because I'm not sure I'm related to these Spearins in Limerick. And that's where the adventure really started. And Bob introduced me to a whole crowd of other Spearin researchers, many of whom had been researching for many years, such as Marilyn and Harriet and Lois in Ontario, Sarah and Philip in Georgia, Pam and Neil in Australia, and Margaret in Ireland. And all of these researchers had different spellings for their Spearin surname. And you can see some of the variants there. But all of us were brick-walled at 1800, and there is a very good reason for that. Like many other countries, Ireland has been the victim of fires in public record offices, such as the Council Office in the Custom House in 1711, the Birmingham Tower in Dublin Castle in 1758, which resulted in the loss of really invaluable documents. And then we lost most of the census information from the 1800s. The 1861 and 1871 censuses were destroyed by a clerical error. The 1881 and 91 were pulped to create paper for the war effort in 1914. Then in 1921, 7 years later, a Custom House fire destroyed some tax returns, but the big fire was that of 1922 in the Public Record Office in the Four Courts, and 5 stories of records were destroyed, and this is the burnt out shell of the Four Courts. 800 years of Irish history went up in smoke in the matter of seconds. And this is what we lost in the fire. And we know this because Herbert Woods put a guide together in 1919 of everything that was in the Public Record Office, a catalogue, if you like. And there were census records of pre-famine Ireland from 1821, 31, 41 and 51. A lot of our ancestors were in these records, and they were lost forever. If they survived, then a lot of Irish Americans and Canadian Americans would actually be able to trace their families much more readily back to the Irish homeland. There are also transportation records back to the 1700s, often containing petitions from prisoners pleading for clemency. There were military records, details of local yeomanry back to the 1700s, and my great-great-great-grandfather Patrick Spearin was probably in these records. There were Church of Ireland parish records dating back to the 1600s, and land transfer records dating back to the same time, wills dating back to the 1500s, court records back to the 1200s with details of criminal and civil cases, and ecclesiastical records such as the Christchurch deeds dating back to 1174. So within a matter of seconds we lost a huge amount of our heritage. What we still have, in fact, is still quite useful. We have 2 censuses from the 1900s, 1901 and 1911, and you can see the number of Spearins there in each one, 88 and 66, and these are freely available online. In fact, many of the resources are freely available online because of the difficulty in tracing Irish genealogy. We have Griffith's valuation with 35 Spearins, Ty the Plotman's with 14, the cancelled books, the civil birth, marriage and death index has about 517, and then we have church records, well over 160, newspapers, 2,822 possible entries, and these have yet to be explored as the newspapers become digitized and put online, and we have 12 will extracts as well. A lot of the information regarding how to research your Irish history is available on the Genetic Genealogy Ireland blog, and if you go to Finding Your Irish Ancestors Online resources, you'll be able to access that information, and there is also a YouTube video as well on that particular link. But of course a lot of the transportation and shipping records are available, and in relation to Canada, in the 1760s people started coming from Ulster. In the 1820s, we had Catholic paupers coming from Clare, Cork and Limerick itself and settling in Peterborough. And then throughout the 1830s and 40s, tens of thousands of Irish came per year into Canada. And a lot of this information is available online. There are several families in Ontario, several Spearin families in Ontario. There's Ontario 1, as we call it, the 5 brothers, John, Luke, Tobias, James and George, whose father was probably George Spearin, who married Hannah Switzer. And that's that's a piece of information that we recently discovered, that Karen recently discovered and posted on the Facebook page. And a second family then is the Ontario 2 family, with the most distant known ancestors being John Spearin and Mary Ruttle. And the third family is the John Spearin and Mary Groves family. Now, what relation these different Johns were, and what these different families are to Ontario 1 remains to be elucidated, but that is something that we may discover within the next several years. The Ontario 1 family is particularly lucky because it has the name Hartwell Spearin therein. So, for example, there's a Hartwell in John's line. There's also a Hartwell in Tobias's line. There's 2 Hartwells in Tobias's line. And the reason why Hartwell is a lucky name is because these early Limerick Spearins, who are mentioned in the wills of 1718 and 1726, you'll see the third line of Luke's will, which is the second one, has the eldest son named Hartwell. And Hartwell is a very unusual name as a forename, as a Christian name. And the Spearin is also quite an unusual name. So to have the combination of Hartwell and Spearin is really quite rare and links people back to these early Limerick Spearins. The wills talk about 3 brothers, Matthew, Luke and Nicholas, and they had a variety of different offspring, including a Hartwell, as you'll see there. Luke, of course, is another relatively rare name that occurs in these early Limerick Spearins, and we do find it in various families. Luke had a son called Luke, and in Ontario 1 there are in fact 3 Lukes. So Luke is another connection back to these early Limerick Spearins. And just to show you how rare the name Hartwell actually is, here are some surname, or some rather forename frequencies from the website Moose Roots, which sounds very Canadian to me. And we look here at the forename Nicholas. And in 1995, 15,000 newborns per million in the US were named Nicholas. So not an uncommon name. If you look at Luke, on the other hand, in the United States in 1999, 5,000 people approximately were named Luke, compared to 16,000 in England and Wales. So it was a much more popular name in the United Kingdom, but relatively rare in the United States. And if we look at Hartwell, well, the records for Hartwell actually stop in 1967, because since that time, fewer than 4 newborns per million have been christened Hartwell as a forename. So it is a very, very rare name, and therefore the combination of Hartwell with the surname Spearin allows us to reasonably deduce that those people whose family branches bear the name Hartwell Spearin can reliably related and associated back to these early Limerick Spearins, where the combination of this name first becomes apparent. Now, my dad's Spearin connection is via his mother's mother. So his grandmother was a Spearin, and it was spelt differently on different documents, but the majority of documents use the spelling S-P-I-E-R-I-N, which is exactly the same as the early Limerick Spearins. And that raises the question, could I also jump back to the early Limerick Spearins, given that my name was spelt the same? But I have no birth record for my great-great-great-grandfather, Patrick Spearin, and the earliest link, in fact, is to Tipperary, and not to Limerick. Patrick Spearin married Mary Morgan in Tipperary, so I've got no link to Limerick for these particular people. So can I rely on the spelling alone to maintain an association with these early Limerick Spearins? And the answer is no, it's not something that I would feel comfortable doing, largely because the standardization of spelling. Now, this person you will recognize, his name is William Shakespeare, but he was also known as Shakespeare, 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 Shakespeare. In fact, there were 17 variants of the name Shakespeare during his own lifetime. And standardization of spelling came very, very late. It wasn't until Dr. Johnson published his famous Dictionary of the English Language in 1755 that standardization of spelling came to be introduced into the English language. And the standardization of surname spelling occurred much later, well into the 1800s, sometimes into the 1900s. And of course we've seen in our own family, in the Spearin experience, that different people have adopted different variations of the surname to suit their own particular needs. So it means that you cannot rely on spelling to necessarily link one person automatically with a particular branch of the family. It can be helpful, it can be a pointer, but it is not a definite. And of course, all of this is irrespective of the problems with literacy and the problems with transcription errors. So some of the Spearins obviously would not have been able to read and write. We see this in the 1901 and 1911 census information, and the people that they were giving their names to probably would not have been able to read or write a lot of the time as well. In fact, in one birth certificate I have the father, the mother and the child all called Spearin, all spelt 3 different ways. So that's when we turned to DNA. And that's going to be the topic of the next video in this series.